Hello, my name is Zuzana Pinkoshova, and I'm a third-year PhD computer science student at Neuroresearch Laboratory at the University of Strathclyde under the supervision of Dr. Yashar Moshfeghi and Dr. William McGowan. I have been attending SINAPSE ASMs for 4 years now, and this is the second time I have this wonderful opportunity to talk to you, this time about cognitive aspects of relevance judgments. I'll start with the introduction where I'll define key terms from titles, starting with relevance. But in order to understand relevance, it's important to first talk about information retrieval. So imagine a user who has information need. So they would, for example, want to know what's the best phone currently available on the market. So they ask, for example, Google. Google then retrieves some documents for the user to evaluate. And the user would, for example, see that the first and second documents are ads, so they skip them, but find the third document to be well written and answering their question. So what the user is doing is making a relevance judgment by interacting with relevant information and skipping irrelevant information. Studying relevance scientifically can be challenging, as relevance is complex and depends on users' subjective perception, and that's why it's important to consider physiological, psychological, and behavioural aspects. And that's also why novel research starts to employ neuroscience. However, in terms of neuroscience, relevance has been examined without considering contextual variables. So what is context? Context determines the situation at hand. Cognitive states, prior knowledge and perception, they create contextual background for relevant judgments. And our main focus will be the prior knowledge. So what is prior knowledge? Prior knowledge refers to the degree of knowledge one has in a particular field or a particular topic. Prior knowledge is important as it improves documents' relevance evaluation. I'll be talking about prior knowledge in more details in later slides, because we have one more important question to answer, which is why are we going to use neuroscientific approach? This is because neuroscience offers unique possibility of exploring dynamic and complex knowledge states while addressing measurement and subjectivity challenges frequently associated with relevance. We would like to understand whether prior knowledge affects the way relevant judgment is processed in the brain. One research question is, do participants' relevant judgment differ significantly based on their previous knowledge? Now I'll be talking about neuroscientific approaches to relevance, and the first study that utilizes neuroscience was a study of Moshfeghi and colleagues who wanted to understand how does relevance happen in the brain. They used fMRI to localize brain activity differences in the cortical regions during the processing of relevant versus non-relevant images. They found differences to be significant in the regions of temporal, frontal, and parietal cortices. Later study on Moshfeghi and Pollack, they found that inferior parietal lobe, inferior temporal gyrus, and superior frontal gyrus play a crucial role during the relevance judgment. The increased activations of these regions for relevant items have been related to visuospatial working memory. Another study of Allegority and colleagues, they were interested to see when does relevance happen in the brain. So they examined the processing of relevant versus non-relevant images, and they found the differences to be most significant within the 500 to 800 millisecond time window. Kim and Kim explored relevance in terms of video skims and found that ERP components N400 and P600 are important indicators of relevant judgments. So let's go back to prior knowledge. In terms of context, prior knowledge has not yet been investigated using brain imaging. Prior knowledge, again, is important because it enhances information retrieval effectiveness. More knowledgeable users tend to identify relevant documents with greater efficiency and achieve greater search success. And in terms of neuroscience, we would like to understand how does prior knowledge contribute to the formation of relevant judgment. So in terms of methodology, for the apparatus, we use 128-channel geodesic sensor net. In terms of design, we utilize a victim-subject design in which participants perform question-answering tasks. So participant would see a question and either relevant or non-relevant answer, and they were also asked whether they already knew the answer to the presented question. So our independent variables was participants' prior knowledge, and our dependent variable was physiological signal. We recruited 4 participants to test the paradigm for the pilot study, and then 25 neurologically healthy participants were recruited for the actual study, but we excluded 2 participants as their data contained noise. In terms of task, participant would see a question, then they would see a fixation cross indicating where the individual words of the answer would appear, and then they would see the answer presented word by word. We presented the answer word by word because we wanted to minimize eye-related artifacts. So after a participant would see enough words of the answer to determine the answer relevance, they would proceed to the next step, which is where they are asked whether they already knew the answer to the question. There are other task aspects that we can revisit later if you're interested. We then link the brain activity recorded during the word presentation with participants' prior knowledge within the context of relevance judgment. We use data-driven approach as it has been shown to be effective in a whole brain analysis, and it minimizes upfront assumptions, and it also allows for the contribution of many distant areas at different time points. We took the values for 109 electrode pairs and compared knowledgeable versus not knowledgeable conditions at every time point, so every 4 milliseconds, over the 200 to 750 millisecond time window. Time intervals from 0 to 200 milliseconds and time interval from 750 to 950 milliseconds were excluded from the main analysis. This is because for the early time interval from 0 to 200 milliseconds, we were not interested in the initial processing of the stimuli, and for the late time interval that usually contain noise related to eye movements and motor movements where participants were submitting their relevant judgments. We used non-parametric permutation-based BRT test with 1,000 permutations that was implemented in StatCon function and EEG lab, and differences were considered significant at p less than 0.05. What did we find? We found that there are significant differences in relevance judgments influenced by participants' prior knowledge. Differences were present within the 340 to 360 millisecond, 400 to 550 millisecond, and 600 to 750 millisecond time intervals between the knowledgeable versus not knowledgeable conditions. These differences might suggest the presence of a variety of distinct cognitive processes that are underpinning different knowledge states within the relevant judgment context. Let's have a look at our results in more details. So for the first significant time interval, 300 to 360 milliseconds, we found a cluster in the central parietal temporal region where the positivity was higher for knowledgeable compared to not knowledgeable condition. In the later cluster, 400 to 550 milliseconds, we found 2 clusters in bilateral central parietal temporal regions, and again, positivity was higher for knowledgeable compared to not knowledgeable condition. And in last significant time interval, 600 to 750 milliseconds, we found 3 clusters, frontocentral, left central temporal, and right parieto-temporal clusters, but the frontocentral cluster was excluded from further interpretations, as when we were looking at topographical plots, the differences were probably significant because of the eye-related artifacts that we could see from the topographical plots. But in terms of the other left central temporal and right parieto-temporal regions, we saw that the positivity was again higher for knowledgeable compared to not knowledgeable conditions. Identified clusters that differ in activity due to knowledgeability overlap with ERP components identified in other studies that are associated with attention, semantic integration, and categorization, memory, and decision making. In conclusion, we found support for the concept of prior knowledge as a contextual variable. We found clear differences in neural activity when information segments are perceived as knowledgeable versus not knowledgeable, and we found that neurological signatures differ due to participants' knowledgeability within the context of relevant judgment. So our study suggests that prior knowledge influences relevance judgment, but we would also like to have a look how does it influence relevant judgment in terms of its granularity. So we would like to see how prior knowledge influences binary and graded relevant judgment. In terms of binary relevance, that means that participants is judging the content either as relevant or not relevant, and in graded relevance, participants is judging content on a greater scale. So for example, judging information as highly relevant, partially relevant, or not relevant. and we would also like to investigate other contextual variables that might influence relevant judgment. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, either in person or feel free to contact me over email or Twitter. Thank you.